In 2015, a team of geneticists led by Qiaomei Fu, working alongside Svante Pabo and David Reich, published a finding that turned a 40,000-year-old jawbone into one of the most quietly devastating documents in the history of human genetics. The jawbone belonged to a man who had lived in what is now Romania, discovered in a cave called Peștera cu Oase in 2002. When his DNA was finally sequenced, researchers found that 6 to 9% of his genome came from a Neanderthal, more than any other human, ancient or modern, ever recorded. The segments of Neanderthal DNA in his chromosomes were long enough, uncut by the generations of genetic reshuffling that normally chop such inheritance into smaller and smaller pieces, that the team could calculate something startlingly precise. This man had a Neanderthal ancestor just 4 to 6 generations back in his family tree. Somewhere around the time of his great-great-grandparents, a modern human and a Neanderthal had a child together. We don't know her name or his. We don't know if it was tender or coerced, brief or lasting, celebrated or hidden. What we know is that it happened, and that it happened often enough, in enough different times and places, that traces of it are sitting in the genome of nearly every person alive today whose ancestry runs outside sub-Saharan Africa. So the question this video is actually asking isn't really about romance in the way we'd casually use the word. It's a much harder and much more interesting question. What kind of relationship between two different human species leaves this kind of evidence behind, and how close can the genetics actually get us to an answer? Let's start with what the DNA can tell us, because it can reveal a great deal, and then be honest about exactly where it stops providing information. Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record roughly 39,000 to 41,000 years ago, after having lived across Europe and Western Asia for around 400,000 years. And yet they never fully left. On average, 1 to 3% of the DNA of every present-day person with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa is Neanderthal in origin. That is not a rounding error or a contamination artifact. It's a measurable, functional inheritance, sitting in your genes right now if you're one of the billions of people it applies to. For that DNA to be there at all, a Neanderthal and a modern human somewhere had to have a child, and that child had to survive, and that child had to grow up and have children of their own, over and over, for tens of thousands of years, until the pattern was durable enough to detect with a genome sequencer in a lab in the 21st century. The Oase individual is the most vivid single piece of evidence for this, because most people's Neanderthal ancestry is old and diffuse, chopped up across dozens of thousands of years of recombination into short, anonymous fragments. He wasn't. It was recent enough to be personal. 4 to 6 generations is not deep evolutionary time. It's a family, within the living memory of the people who knew them. Somewhere in his direct lineage, close enough to remember, was a Neanderthal grandmother, or grandfather, or great-grandparent, whose relationship with a modern human produced him. Here's the detail that makes this even stranger. Geneticist David Reich, who coordinated the population analysis on the Oase study, noted that this particular man doesn't appear to have any direct descendants among later Europeans. His specific lineage seems to have simply ended, possibly part of an early wave of modern humans into Europe that mixed closely with Neanderthals and then, for reasons we don't know, didn't continue. Svante Pabo, who led the study, described finding this individual as an almost impossibly lucky break, calling it, in his own words, such a lucky and unexpected thing to get DNA from a person who was so closely related to a Neanderthal, which tells you something important right there. Even to the scientists who found it, this wasn't treated as a routine data point. It was treated as something close to a story. So we know interbreeding happened, we know it happened repeatedly, and we know at least once it happened recently enough to leave a name-shaped hole in the historical record where an actual couple used to be. What we genuinely cannot know, and this is where the video has to slow down and be careful, is what any of these relationships actually felt like from the inside. The genetics records the fact of reproduction. They record absolutely nothing about its circumstances. A child resulting from a long-term partnership between two people who knew and cared for each other, and a child resulting from an assault, leave identical genetic signatures 400 centuries later. No molecule encodes consent. This isn't a minor caveat tacked onto the end of the story. It's the central honest limitation of the entire field, and any account of ancient interbreeding that skips past it in favor of a tidier, more romantic narrative is telling you more about what it wants to believe than about what the evidence actually supports. With that limitation squarely on the table, though, there is real evidence worth weighing on both sides of the question of what these encounters were like. and it's more interesting than a flat shrug of "we'll never know." Start with what argues against these being isolated, hostile, one-off encounters. Interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals wasn't a single event. Genetic evidence points to multiple separate episodes of mixing in different regions over an extended span of time, likely beginning around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago in the Middle East as modern humans first expanded out of Africa, and continuing later and independently in Europe, which is exactly what the Oase individual represents. That pattern, repeated contact across thousands of years and multiple geographies, is much more consistent with two populations that overlapped, encountered each other regularly, and had a variety of ongoing relationships than with a single catastrophic event. There's also the matter of what the resulting hybrid children needed to survive at all. A newborn with one Neanderthal parent and one modern human parent in a Paleolithic environment needed the same things every Paleolithic infant needed: protection, warmth, nursing, and years of committed care from adults willing to keep that specific child alive through infancy and childhood. That doesn't rule out a coercive origin, but it does tell us that whatever happened at conception, the children who resulted from these unions were, in at least some cases, integrated into a group, raised and cared for long enough to grow up and eventually have children of their own. Somebody fed that child. Somebody carried that child. Somebody, whether the Neanderthal parent, the human parent, or the wider group around them, decided this child belonged. Now for the evidence that complicates any purely warm reading of this story, because it exists too, and it's worth taking seriously. A 2016 study led by geneticist Sriram Sankararaman examined the distribution of Neanderthal DNA across the modern human genome and found something specific and slightly unsettling. Neanderthal ancestry is noticeably reduced on the X chromosome, and it's almost absent from genes that are highly expressed in the testes. That pattern is a recognized genetic signature of hybrid infertility, specifically suggesting that male hybrid offspring, the children of a Neanderthal father and a modern human mother, or vice versa, frequently had reduced fertility or were sterile. This is a well-documented phenomenon in other closely related species that interbreed, sometimes called Haldane's rule, where the sex with two different sex chromosomes tends to suffer the most severe effects of hybridization. It doesn't tell us anything about whether individual relationships were loving or coerced, but it does tell us that even when these unions happened and produced children, biology itself was working against many of those children ever having children of their own, which is part of why Neanderthal ancestry in living humans today is a fairly small diluted percentage rather than something closer to 50%. There's also the matter of what a mixed ancestry child's life might have actually looked like inside a group of one species or the other. A child with a Neanderthal parent, raised among modern humans, would have been visibly, physically different from the people around them, and the same would be true in reverse. Whether that difference meant curiosity, acceptance, suspicion, or exclusion is something the bones and the DNA are simply silent on. Archaeology gives us objects and skeletons. It does not give us access to how a specific community felt about a specific child. We are, on this particular point, guessing, and it's important to say so plainly rather than paper over the gap with a comforting story in either direction. What we can say with more confidence is what these unions left behind, because, unlike the emotional texture of the relationships themselves, the genetic consequences are measurable, and some of them were remarkably useful. Certain Neanderthal-derived genes that persist in modern populations appear to have been actively beneficial, not just neutral hitchhikers along for the ride. Variants affecting immune function show up repeatedly in studies of Neanderthal ancestry, plausibly because Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years already adapting to European and Asian pathogens that modern humans, fresh out of Africa, hadn't yet encountered. In effect, some of the descendants of these unions may have inherited a head start on disease resistance in unfamiliar environments, quite literally passed down from a Neanderthal parent or grandparent. Other Neanderthal-derived variants have been linked to skin and hair traits suited to higher latitudes, again, plausibly reflecting hundreds of thousands of years of Neanderthal adaptation to environments modern humans were only just arriving in. The Denisovans, a separate and even more mysterious archaic human population identified almost entirely from a single finger bone and a couple of teeth found in Siberia's Denisova cave, tell an even more striking version of this same story. Denisovan DNA shows up today at its highest concentrations in Aboriginal Australians, Papua New Guineans, and some island Southeast Asian populations. Evidence of separate interbreeding events entirely distinct from the Neanderthal mixing happening farther west. One particular inherited gene variant, called EPAS1, appears to have entered the modern human gene pool specifically through Denisovan ancestry, and it plays a direct, measurable role in how efficiently Tibetan populations today process oxygen at extreme high altitude, allowing sustained life and labor in conditions that would leave most other humans dangerously hypoxic. Somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, a Denisovan and a modern human had a child, and the genetic legacy of that union is, quite literally, still helping people breathe on mountains today. So put this together, and a fuller picture starts to take shape, one considerably more layered than either a simple love story or a simple story of violence. Modern humans and Neanderthals shared overlapping territory across Europe and Western Asia for thousands of years. During that overlap, they had children together, repeatedly, in more than one region, across a long enough span of time that it wasn't one accident, but an ongoing pattern. Some of those children almost certainly struggled with reduced fertility, a biological tax on hybridization that limited how much of that ancestry could be passed forward. Some of those children clearly did survive, thrive, and reproduce, carrying forward genetic advantages, disease resistance, and environmental adaptations that in some specific cases are still actively useful in human bodies today. And underneath all of it sits an unanswerable, deeply human question about what any specific one of those relationships was actually like to the two people at the center of it. A question the science can gesture toward but never fully close. The Oase individual is where this all comes back into focus, because he's the closest thing we have to a face on this story, rather than a statistic. 4 to 6 generations before a man died in a cave in Romania, roughly 40,000 years ago, one of his direct ancestors was a Neanderthal. Not a distant, diffuse contribution smoothed out over hundreds of generations, but a grandparent or great-grandparent, someone close enough that people who knew him might have known them too, might have had opinions about them, might have loved them or resented them, or simply accepted them as part of the family, the way families are accepted. We will never know which. The genetics that let us calculate exactly how many generations back that ancestor sat cannot tell us a single thing about what it felt like to be that ancestor, or to be their child, or to be the modern human who chose, or didn't choose, to build a life with them. What we do know is that the boundary between species, the thing that sounds in a textbook like the cleanest, most absolute line biology draws, turned out in practice to be porous, repeatedly, in multiple places over thousands of years. Two different kinds of human, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of independent evolution, met, and at least sometimes, chose each other, or were drawn to each other, or ended up entangled with each other closely enough to have children who lived long enough to have children of their own. Whether that counts as love, in any sense we'd recognize, is a question the evidence simply cannot answer. But it counts as something close enough to intimacy that its trace is sitting in the DNA of most people reading these words right now. A small, quiet inheritance from an encounter between two kinds of human that no longer both exist, carried forward without any memory of the two people who started it, all the way down to you.